All right, so we've got President Zelensky visiting President Trump in Washington. And on the surface, it's to finalize a mineral deal. But things went off the rails pretty quickly. Instead of, the usual ceremony and the signing, we end up with this very public, very heated argument. It really kind of lays bare the tension between the two.
Yeah, and looking at these sources, what's really interesting is that the whole thing starts to come apart. While the press is still in the room, a journalist asks President Trump to respond to these accusations that he's citing with Putin. You can just feel the tension ratchet up immediately.
Yeah, I mean, that's a heck of a way to start a meeting.
Yeah.
Right. So how does Trump handle that question right out of the gate?
Well, he insists that he's on the side of the U.S. and that he wants to see this conflict end peacefully. In fact, he claims that both Zelensky and Putin really dislike each other and that this is making any kind of deal very difficult. He even says that he could be tougher on Putin, but he doesn't believe that would actually lead to peace.
Wow. So he's basically saying that his way is the only way to peace. But then Vice President Vance enters the conversation.
Right. And Vance, he really draws this contrast between the current administration and the previous one. He argues that diplomacy, as practiced by Trump, is the real key to peace and prosperity. And he seems to be suggesting that all the tough talk from the previous administration, with not much action behind it, that was really ineffective.
Okay. But Zelensky, he's not buying it, right? He pushes back on this idea and reminds Vance that this whole thing has been dragging on since 2014. He points out that there have been attempts at diplomacy before, but agreements get broken and the situation doesn't change. He even brings up that broken ceasefire agreement from 2019.
Yeah, and it's a powerful moment because Zelensky, he's challenging that narrative that diplomacy is this, easy fix. He's coming at this from his lived experience, pointing out these repeated failures.
And this is where the conversation really starts to get heated up. Vance doesn't back down. He doubles down, saying that diplomacy is the only way to stop the fighting in Ukraine. But then he criticizes Zelensky for bringing all of this up publicly. He even accuses Zelensky of disrespecting the U.S. by, airing these grievances in front of the press.
Yeah, that's a really interesting twist, right? It seems like Vance is putting a lot of emphasis on appearances. More than the substance of what Zelensky is saying, it just highlights how far apart their perspectives are. Zelensky is dealing with the reality of this conflict, and Vance is focused on keeping up this diplomatic facade.
Of course, Zelensky doesn't just take this lying down. He fires back. And he argues that Vance just doesn't understand how bad things really are, because he's so far removed from the conflict. Zelensky even implies that the U.S., despite its distance right now, will eventually be affected by what's happening in Ukraine.
That's a bold statement. He's basically saying that this conflict will have consequences for the U.S. whether they get involved or not, almost like a warning.
And then, Trump just explodes. He accuses Zelensky of disrespect, and he says that the U.S. will always be strong.
It's clear that Trump takes Zelensky's comment very personally. His response is this forceful assertion of U.S. strength and a rejection of the idea that they could be vulnerable. And that really sets the stage for the argument to escalate even further.
And it just goes downhill from there. The whole thing gets even more heated. Trump accuses Zelensky of gambling with millions of lives, of risking a global conflict, and even of making the situation worse for his own personal gain.
Yeah. It's amazing how personal the attacks get. Trump is basically calling Zelensky reckless and selfish, completely throwing diplomacy out the window. It really shows how broken their relationship is.
It's like a car crash you can't look away from. And then Vance tries to step in again. He urges Zelensky to thank the U.S. and Trump for trying to help Ukraine.
Right.
But it feels so awkward, like he's trying to force a reconciliation in the middle of this huge fight.
Yeah, it's this really uncomfortable attempt to smooth things over. I mean, you can just imagine the tension in that room. Vance is trying to make it seem like everything's fine, and Zelensky is obviously not feeling very grateful at that moment.
And of course, Trump jumps right back in. He cuts Zelensky off and says that the situation in Ukraine is really bad and that the U.S. is offering a way out. But it sounds a lot like take it or leave it. Like he's putting all the pressure on Zelensky to accept their solution.
There's this real sense of urgency in Trump's voice. He's saying this is your only option, basically emphasizing how much power he has in this situation.
And then things get even crazier. As they're talking over each other, Trump claims that the war would already be over if it wasn't for the previous president's military aid. He even calls the previous president stupid.
Wow, that's a huge accusation. He's blaming the previous administration for the conflict continuing. Like, their involvement is the reason things are so bad. It's a risky move, to say the least, especially given how sensitive this whole situation is.
And Zelensky, he's not having it. He makes a sarcastic comment, which, of course, makes things worse. Trump then It says straight up that working with Zelensky is going to be a challenge. You could just feel the temperature in the room rising.
That whole exchange sums up their whole interaction. Miscommunication, animosity, and a complete inability to see eye-eye. Their relationship is in pieces. It's hard to see how they can move forward after this.
Yeah, it feels like the whole meeting's about to explode.
Yeah.
And that's basically what happens. It ends really abruptly after this whole blow-up. And reports even came out later that Trump asked Zelensky to leave. I mean, the mineral deal is dead in the water. There's no joint press conference. It's a total and complete diplomatic disaster.
Yeah, it's a pretty dramatic ending. And it shows you just how badly their relationship fell apart. The fact that they couldn't even pretend to get along for the press.
Yeah.
That says it all. It really seems like the damage is done and there's not much hope for cooperation in the future.
But it doesn't end there, right? Trump releases a statement afterwards, trying to control how the story gets told. He claims the meeting was, informative, but then accuses Zelensky of not being ready for peace and of disrespecting the U.S. It's a pretty bold move trying to shift the blame after that whole mess.
It's a classic move by someone in power. Trump's basically saying that Zelensky was the one who blew this chance for peace. He's making Zelensky look like he's not willing to work with the U.S., and that makes it even harder for them to trust each other in the future.
So when you look back at this whole meeting, it was clearly about a lot more than just some mineral deal, right? It was these two huge personalities clashing. It was a fight for control. And it was this very public display of how broken the relationship between the U.S. and Ukraine had become.
Absolutely. This meeting gave us this really rare look into how these two leaders and their countries interact. We saw these two totally different ideas about diplomacy, the struggle for power, and this total lack of trust. It makes you wonder what's going to happen to U.S.-Ukraine relations, and if there's any chance of a peaceful solution to the conflict.
It's definitely a lot to think about, and it leaves us with a lot of questions. How will this public fight affect future negotiations? What happens to the people stuck in the middle of this conflict because their leaders can't communicate? And what does it all mean for the bigger picture?
Those are the million-dollar questions. And the truth is, there's no easy answers. The situation is still really unstable. It's hard to say what's going to happen long-term, but one thing is for sure. This whole thing has really changed how the U.S. and Ukraine relate to each other, and the consequences are going to be felt for years to come.
Well, that was quite a deep dive. Subscribe to our podcast, available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear. New episodes every day.